He's hanging half 100 on him at Owen Field. Or the run rules on the diamond at Lowe's Field. We're giving you the breakdowns, the bets, and the hot takes from the perspective of two former OU Athletics employees. You're listening to the Mainline Podcast with Tyler Burton and Adam Jaquez.
Let's go! Let's go! Go!
Let's go. Welcome to the Mainline. It's one of our favorite weeks of the year. We're doing our national predictions. I'm Adam Jaquez. He's Tyler Burton. We're going to get into some of the most surprising and most disappointing teams that we are predicting across each of the major conferences. We're going to talk about conference winners. We're going to predict Heisman winners and, of course, a national champion as well. So before we dive into that, Tyler, how are you this evening?
Adam, I'm doing good. 1 month, ladies and gentlemen, from OU football returning to the season for 2024. Things are good. This is one of my favorite episodes that we do each and every season, Adam, and it's also one of my favorite episodes that when the season's over and we have a chance to kind of take a look back and look at some of our preseason predictions, you know, kind of see what came true, what was some of the most asinine takes out there. You know, we both have our share of them over the last 4 seasons of doing this. But yeah, I'm very excited about this. We're going to talk some college football. We're going to talk some conference title matchups, give some of our takes on who's going to surprise some folks this year, maybe who's going to be a disappointing team in each conference. And then I'm very, very excited to kind of lay my picks out as far as who I think is going to win the Heisman Trophy and the team I'm actually picking to raise the trophy at the very end of the season. So let's get it going.
Absolutely. Unlike most normal weeks where we focus completely on Oklahoma football and Oklahoma sports, that's going to be coming in the coming weeks for us here on the Main Line, talking practice buzz for fall camp, doing offense and defense previews and so forth from there. And then it'll be game week before you know it. We're going to be talking fully national here. So let's get things kicked off with the ACC conference. Tyler, I guess we should start with our conference title game matchup and the winner there, and then we'll work into our surprising and disappointing teams. I'll let you take the floor there to kick us off with the ACC.
Yeah, conference championship matchup. I mean, it kind of feels like the simple chalk answer is to simply say that Clemson and Florida State are going to figure out a way to match up at the end of the regular season. I've got one of those two that are going to be a part of this, but I've actually got a team that is also a resident of the state of Florida down there in Miami that I think is going to be a part of this as well. But kicking things off, I think that Clemson's going to be one of the two playing in Charlotte for the ACC title. 14 returning starters, a veteran offensive line with 5 upperclassmen coming back for Dabo. You've got quarterback Cade Klubnik, who's returning for his second full season as the Tigers starter. He's going to look to improve on his stats from a year ago that was a little bit disappointing. I think a lot of hype, you know, with Cade Klubnik coming into last season with some of the weapons that he had. The fact that he only had a 63% completion percentage to go with 19 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, a little bit of an underwhelming type season in year one for Cade Klubnik. But you flip it over to the defensive side of the football. I know that they have to replace 5 NFL draft picks, including all 4 defensive linemen. But when you look at what Dabo Swinney has continued to do, I know that he hasn't, you know, he's not a believer in the transfer portal, hasn't taken a single guy from the portal over the last couple of seasons, but he has recruited elite level defensive linemen the past couple of cycles. And because of that talent combined with the experienced back 7, I still believe that Clemson will have the top defense in the ACC. Schedule, a little bit up in the air. They do open with Georgia. They do get Louisville, NC State, and South Carolina at home. So that's great for the Tigers. But on the flip side of it, they do have tough road trips to Blacksburg to take on Virginia Tech, and they do have to go on the road to Tallahassee to take on Mike Norvell and the Seminoles. So there's going to be a ton of hype around that Florida State game, particularly Clemson's won the last 3 trips going down to Tallahassee, and it is the first matchup against their former quarterback in DJ Uiagalelei. So that's going to be some big-time storylines surrounding that game. But I do think that Clemson will do enough to secure one of those 2 spots in the ACC championship. And then you flip it over to the other side, who's going to be matching up against them. I'm taking a flyer on this one, Adam. I'm going with Miami. Week 1 in the Swamp. Tough opening regular season game for Mario Cristobal. That we're going to find out a lot about what the Hurricanes are going to have for this 2024 season right off the bat. Clemson is not on the schedule, thankfully, for Mario Cristobal. They do get Florida State and Virginia Tech both at home. 10 starters back on offense, 7 on defense, and you replace Tyler Van Dyke with one of the biggest quarterback names to enter the transfer portal since the transfer portal became a thing, and that's Cam Ward, one of the most dynamic players in the ACC. And to me, Adam, this is it for Mario Cristobal. Year 3 in the Sunshine State. It's put up or shut up time. If the Hurricanes can't get it done this year with this talent, with this schedule, I'm sure not too sure that Mario Cristobal is the guy that Canes fans thought that they were going to be getting when they pulled him away from Oregon 3 years ago. But because of all the factors I just laid out, I think Miami does enough to earn a spot in the ACC title game. And you want me to go ahead and give my prediction? Or we save that here for a little bit.
Let's save it until both of us have given our title game participants here.
Clemson
I'm in alignment.
versus Miami.
Clemson versus Miami. I'm in alignment on Clemson there. I know Boom Squad saying they have a dangerous game in week 1 versus Georgia, but that doesn't matter. You can lose that game to Georgia. I don't think there's moral victories there, but you can feel really good if you play that within a possession, or maybe you pull off the upset and beat Georgia.
Yeah.
You can feel really good about this Tigers team and Cade Klubnik in year 2, Garrett Riley, the offensive coordinator, in year 2. Maybe hitting their stride. You've got Phil Moffa at that running back position. You talk about the defense and the way they've recruited there. Well, they've recruited better in the wide receiver room as well. Bryant Wesco was a guy that Oklahoma desperately wanted to be in Norman. Yes. He's at Clemson. TJ Moore, a guy that some thought maybe he might end up at Oklahoma towards the end of the recruiting cycle last year. He's at Clemson as well. So there's young guys. If you get one of those guys to break out and be the high 4-star, the 5-star type of player that they are for Cade Klubnik, I think that can really turn things around for Dabo Swinney. So there's still a ton of talent at Clemson. There's still a good culture there. It's weird. It's different, but I think it's enough to get the ACC championship game. I also zagged a little bit when everyone is zigging on Florida State as well, because there's some holes at Florida State. They do well in the transfer portal. They've done well in recruiting, but they only return 8 starters across the entire team. That doesn't count DJ Uiagalelei, who he's nice. I don't think he's going to carry the team, though, necessarily. So I have concerns about them. And I know you look at their early schedule. They play Boston College right off the bat. They play Georgia Tech actually in week 0. You look at those and you go, oh, those aren't tough. But those are conference games in weeks 1 and 2. That's unusual for most teams to be doing that. And that is a lot harder to win those types of games. You play Memphis in week 3. You play Cal, who, I mean, Cal's not great, but I think they're capable of pulling an upset. So there's no gimme on Florida State's schedule until the second to last week of the year when they host Charleston Southern. So they've got actually, I think, a little bit underrated of a tough schedule in a sense. So I'm actually not going to go with the Noles there. I'm going to go in a different direction. I'm going to go with Virginia Tech. And I've talked myself into some weird ones. This might be the weirdest one that I have for the whole episode, is picking Virginia Tech to go to the ACC title game. But they returned quite a lot of production. 11 starters back on offense, 8 on defense. They go to Miami early in the season, so maybe they get the Canes before they're rocking and rolling. And then they host Clemson late in the year. That's a tough one for the Tigers. But Virginia Tech, that's a program that, Brent Pry's done a great job there, I think, through 3 years. I think he's going into year 3 now. So I like what Kyron Drones, their quarterback, brings to the table. He only had 3 interceptions last year. He rushed for 800 yards out of that quarterback position. So I think he's a guy that can carry a team, and we'll see what happens. That one's kind of my boldest take, though, is Virginia Tech.
Game. And I get the hype surrounding Florida State after an undefeated season a year ago, but I'm not a believer in them being able to repeat that and, make their way back to the ACC championship game. And a large part of that is due to the schedule, like you talked about, Adam. They've got to play Clemson and Florida at home. They've got to travel to Miami to take on Mario Cristobal. And then they've got to actually go on the road to South Bend to take on Notre Dame. So I think Florida State is going to be a really good football team this year, but I'd still see 2 to 3 losses for the Seminoles. Adam, I wasn't all the way there with Virginia Tech, but I think that this is a good transition because I actually do have the Hokies of Virginia Tech as my most surprising team in the ACC this year. We get to see the second year of quarterback Kyron Jones, who was actually, started out his career at Baylor down there in Waco, Texas. And, Jones had some growing pains last year, but towards the latter part of the season, particularly the last 4 games of the season, he did lead the Hokies offense to an average of 43 points per game. So there's a lot of talent. There's a lot of excitement around Blacksburg right now with what Virginia Tech's bringing back. Defensively, they've got double-digit starters returning. The schedule is very favorable if you're a Virginia Tech fan right now, especially the non-conference. They do have a Friday night matchup on the road at Miami, but they get Clemson at home, and they do avoid Louisville, which has kind of been a trap game for Virginia Tech over the last few years going up against the Cardinals. But, not having Louisville, not having Florida State, not having SMU, who I forgot was even a part of the ACC until I started kind of diving into this a little bit more, but not having those teams on the schedule, I think that there's a very realistic chance that Virginia Tech is an 8, 9, maybe even a 10-win football team if all the, dominoes fall in their direction. I like Virginia Tech. That's a good pick, Adam.
Last year, for my most disappointing team, I picked Louisville because I just thought everyone was overrating the schedule thing. But this year, it's really hard to just ignore, oh,
Yeah.
this team's got the better schedule, this team's got the tougher schedule, because there's complete imbalance in pretty much every conference with these 14, 16 team, 18 team conferences. So I'm trying not to just play into the schedule, but for my most surprising team, I have to in the ACC, and that's Syracuse. Fran Brown, new coach there, has, I think, pumped a little bit of life into that program, and their schedule's not that tough. Their toughest conference games are at NC State, Virginia Tech at home, or Miami at home. Not that difficult. So they do have Kyle McCord
Yeah.
there. I don't know if he's necessarily an upgrade over Garrett Schrader, who they had previously, but he played at Ohio State, so at least that's something. But I think the schedule is fairly easy, to the point where if the Orange can go out and win 8 games, that's solid. That's solid for Syracuse. So I'll go with the Orange there on my most surprising. Who do you have for most disappointing team in the ACC?
The team that I'm choosing is the most disappointing. It's not simply because I think that they're going to fall flat off the face of the earth. I think it's simply based on the fact that the preseason expectation is that this is going to be a team that's going to be a serious contender to win the ACC championship and be, kind of an automatic qualifier to make the college football playoff. And that's Florida State. We talked about it where DJ Uiagalelei steps in a quarterback for Jordan Travis. They did lose a bunch of guys to the NFL in graduation, but Mike Norvell has been stacking top 10 classes since he got to Tallahassee, and they have had some big, key pickups in the transfer portal. And, we've talked about the schedule, Adam, obviously Clemson and Florida at home. Florida, which we'll touch on a little bit later in the podcast. I think that a lot of people, they think that Florida and Billy Napier, they think that that's just an automatic win for any team that's going to be taking on the Gators this year. I'm actually a little bit higher on Florida going into this season. And I think the fact that they're going to be taking on Florida to close out the regular season, I think that by that point in the season, Florida is going to be a much better football team than if Florida State were to catch them, within the first couple of weeks of the season. So I talked about the fact that they've got to go on the road to South Bend to take on Notre Dame. They've got Miami, they've got Florida, they've got Clemson. I think it's going to be a little bit of an uphill climb, and I think that you're looking at a 2 to 3 loss season, which, again, if you're a 9-3 Florida State football team, it's not the end of the world, but with how good of a job Mike Norvell has done over the last couple of seasons in Tallahassee, raising that bar and the level of expectation up to what Florida State fans have, grown used to throughout the history of Florida State. I think that it is going to be a little bit of a disappointing year for Florida State, and the fact that I think that this is a 9-3 type football team that's not going to make it to the Charlotte for the ACC title game, and I think they'll be on the outside looking in for the 12-team playoff.
You mentioned that Florida game at the end of the year for Florida State, and
Yeah.
Billy Napier, if he's still the coach of the Gators at that point, that means they probably have had a good year and they're a good team.
Something's gone right.
If he's not the head coach, then you have an interim typically that the players love, and sometimes that gives them the boost. So it's almost a no-win situation for Florida State in that rivalry game at the end of the year. So I definitely agree that I think that's a dangerous one. My most disappointing team, I got to go with SMU here, because everyone talks about them like, oh man, they'll go into the ACC, they'll be just fine. They've been a power program really for the most part. And like, I don't agree with that. They played 2 power teams last year. They played Oklahoma, who was a top 15 team in the country, lost by 3 scores, played TCU, who only had 5 wins, lost by 3 scores to the Horned Frogs as well. So and I look too at the teams that joined the Big 12 conference last year out of that group of 5. UCF, I think, probably did the best. And what did they go? 6-6, 7-6, something like that. So I don't think SMU is in better shape than UCF was going into the Big 12. So SMU's got a tough road ahead of them. I don't care if they're playing Georgia Tech or Virginia or whoever's on their schedule. Like, playing that back-to-back, moving from group of 5 to a power conference is very difficult. So I'm not buying the hype on SMU just yet. I think they're a good program, but they're not the best program positioned to move into the power conference. So there'll be a little bit of adjustment period, I think, for the Mustangs there. So SMU is my most disappointing team. So that leads us to who's going to win this conference, the ACC. Tyler, you had Clemson versus Miami in your championship game. Who do you have winning that?
Yeah, Clemson's won the ACC title 7 out of the last 9 years. I don't think that changes this season. So again, I think that they've got the best coach in the conference. They're going to have the best defense in the conference. I think that Kate Klubnik's going to have an opportunity to take another step forward this year. So for those reasons, I think that Clemson, they win their 8th out of the last 10 ACC championships, and they're going to be one of those top 4 seeds in the college football playoff this year.
I have that as well. I have Clemson beating Virginia Tech in my championship game for all the same reasons you just mentioned there. I don't think that there's going to be a second team from the ACC in the playoffs. We're not predicting playoff teams tonight, but it just kind of feels like if you're playing Virginia Tech or Miami versus Clemson, or let's sub Florida State in for Clemson, I don't think that there's a second ACC team in the playoffs just based on who we have in those matchups. So let's head to the Big Ten Conference here. Who do you have making your conference championship game? This one being played in Indianapolis.
So I didn't go chalk in the ACC, but I'm going to go chalk here. I think that this one's pretty simple. I think that there are two teams in this conference that are head and shoulders above everybody else, both from a production standpoint, from a coaching staff standpoint, but also with, just how talented these rosters are from top to bottom. I think that the two teams that are going to be playing in Indianapolis this season, call me crazy, it's Oregon and Ohio State. Dan Lanning versus Ryan Day, Dylan Gabriel versus Will Howard. I think that these is going to be a matchup that we see not just in the regular season in Eugene, but these are going to be the two teams that kind of face off in the rematch. And what I think is going to essentially be a game in the Big Ten championship that's going to be for one of the top 4 seeds to come college football playoff time. I think that both of these two teams do make the college football playoff, but when you start talking about, battling for seeds and, who gets to host a home game, who gets to have the bye week, I think that these are two teams that are going to be matched up, and these are going to be 1 and 2 in the Big Ten conference all year. So yeah, I got Oregon versus Ohio State.
I have Ohio State in there as well. I think they're going to be so dominant. I'm not super high on Will Howard. I mean, we saw him a lot at K-State. He turned the ball over, I think, 9 times last year. He never had more than 24 passing touchdowns, but I feel like he can just ride the rest of that roster like Stetson Bennett did. And maybe he has some great games in there. Maybe he's solid. Maybe he never really gets tested. We'll find out. But the roster around him is going to be so dominant that it almost doesn't matter who you put back there at quarterback. I mean, we saw it last year with Kyle McCord. That team basically just kind of autopiloted, and I think they're even better at the supporting positions. So I've got Ohio State in the championship game. I'm going to go with, I thought really hard about putting Iowa in there, because if you look at Iowa, their schedule is actually still fairly easy. I know everyone talks about the going away from the divisions in the Big Ten West, but after Ohio State, Iowa's next toughest game is either Wisconsin at home or Nebraska at home. And now they've got Cade McNamara healthy at quarterback, a new offensive coordinator. Look out for the Hawkeyes. I couldn't quite pull a trigger on that one because I was like, that one, I feel like that one would come back to bite me halfway through the year. But I'm going to go with Penn State. Penn State's beaten everybody but Michigan and Ohio State, it seems like, for the last decade or so.
You think James Franklin, this is the year finally?
I think they'll make the Big Ten title game at minimum, because they only play at Ohio State. Their next toughest game after that is either at Wisconsin or at USC. I guess they could lose one of those potentially, but they don't play Michigan. They don't play Oregon. The schedule works out pretty well for them. They've Drew Allers in his second year. So you kind of look, there's some similarities to Clemson with a second-year quarterback and probably expanding the offense under a new coordinator that comes over from Kansas. So I think Penn State is in the right position with the right schedule to make it to Indianapolis and play versus Ohio State in the championship game. But I do like the Hawkeyes as well. I will probably continue to bet the under there as we get into the regular season. One of my favorite traditions is losing an under versus an Iowa game. But let's go on to most surprising team. Who do you have here, Tyler?
Well, you got to give your pick. You got to tell me who's going to win. You want to save it for the end? Okay,
we'll save it for the end. Like we do with ACC.
Most surprising team. I'm going to keep this one short and sweet. I'm going to go with Nebraska on this one, and I feel really good about this take, which probably means that Nebraska is going to go 4-8. But Nebraska is going into the second year of the Matt Rule era. They've got 19 starters back, and they get to add true freshman quarterback Dylan Raiola to the mix. By far and away the best quarterback talent since Taylor Martinez was a Husker. You go down, you look at Nebraska's schedule, they avoid Penn State, they avoid Michigan, they avoid Oregon on the schedule. They've got Colorado coming to Lincoln in week 2, and I think that they're going to beat Colorado's ass to really kind of get this hype train going up there in Lincoln, Nebraska. And, Adam, I think that there's a very realistic chance when you look at this Nebraska schedule, I think they could be 7-0 when they go to the shoe on October 26th. Now, their last 5 games are extremely difficult. At Ohio State, UCLA at home, at USC, Wisconsin at home, and then they close out the regular season against a team that you're super high on, the Iowa Hawkeyes. but I think Nebraska is improved enough to where they can win 8 to 9 ball games, which would be a huge improvement for Matt Rule when you look at what he did last year, and a huge improvement over what Nebraska football has become over the last decade. It'd be nice to see, good old Red get back up there towards the top of the Big Ten Conference.
I thought about taking Nebraska at most surprising, but I almost feel like the offseason hype train is so much that it won't surprise me if they win 6 games, but it should. Like, that would be a huge accomplishment for the Cornhuskers. And I like the pieces. Yeah. I like their defense a ton. I'm going to one of the teams that's predicted often to finish second to last, maybe even dead last, is the Indiana Hoosiers. And here's their schedule. I said back in the ACC, I didn't want to pick the team with just the best schedule and setup, but you look at Indiana's schedule, I don't think there's very many guaranteed losses on there. Florida International, Western Illinois, at UCLA, Charlotte, Maryland, at Northwestern, Nebraska, probably a loss, but we've seen Nebraska, lose a lot of games they should win. Washington, they're gutted, at Michigan State. And then the end of the year, they're at Michigan, or they're playing Michigan and at Ohio State, and then round out with Purdue. So to me, I look at that schedule and I go, okay, I think there's probably 2 games in there, Michigan and Ohio State, where I'm like, those are guaranteed losses. Mm-hmm. The others, it's like, well, they might be an underdog, but I could see a path to victory versus Maryland, versus Northwestern. Like, the schedule's just super soft. You get a new coach in there, and Kurt Signetti from James Madison, who has won everywhere he's been. You get the Ohio transfer, Curtis Rourke. Yeah, Curtis Rourke, the transfer from Ohio, is a very experienced guy at quarterback. He might not be the biggest stats guy or anything like that, but he's a steady hand there. They've made a ton of investments at Indiana in the NIL space. Signetti brings a lot of guys over from James Madison. I don't know. I like the direction. I like the feel of Indiana right now. I mean, they can't disappoint. They can only surprise at this point. So I'll take the Hoosiers there.
10 starters back on offense, all 11 returning on defense for the Hoosiers this year. Watch out. You heard it here first. Watch out for Indiana. We're not talking basketball. We're talking football. Watch out for the Hoosiers this year. Adam, most disappointing team, keeping it with you here.
So this may be picked up on because I didn't put them in the Big Ten title game, and that's Oregon. Now, I'm the biggest fan of Dylan Gabriel. Ooh. I've been one of his biggest defenders on this show going back 2+ years now. I think he was great at Oklahoma. I think he was exactly what we needed. He goes to Oregon now, and maybe it's because he's outside of the Oklahoma bubble, but it's almost like, oh, well, he'll probably be in New York for the Heisman Trophy. And I'm like, yeah, he's very capable of that. Is the supporting cast that much better at Oregon? Did Dylan Gabriel suddenly get that much better going to Oregon?
Yes.
I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that completely. I think it's similar enough. I don't know that there's some receiver at Oregon that is going to suddenly rack up his stats and suddenly he'll be beating Ohio State and whoever else is on their schedule as well. I think do they play Michigan? I think, but I don't know. It just feels like the hype train on Oregon is really, really high, to the point of like, hey, if they lose 2 games in the Big Ten, they might not make the Big Ten championship game. They host Ohio State. I know that's at home, but I don't know. The whole travel element, it affects USC and UCLA and how people perceive them. Doesn't seem to affect Oregon, but Oregon still has to do the travel as well. So yeah, I don't know. I just wonder about the Ducks, and I wonder if Dylan Gabriel is good enough to take them to Indianapolis to beat Ohio State at least once. Because if you don't do that at least once, right, I feel like that's probably a disappointment for the Ducks.
Yeah, I couldn't disagree with you more, and we'll get to that here in just a little bit when we give our conference championship winner here. But most disappointing team for me, Oklahoma fans, this is going to make you extremely happy for the next 45 to 60 seconds. I'm going with USC. Year 3 of Muleshoe, no Caleb Williams, new defensive coordinator, now a member of the Big Ten Conference. Their schedule, combined with the brand of football that teams in Big Ten country like to play, is a bad recipe for teams coached by Lincoln Riley, particularly his defenses. Vegas has their win total right now, Adam. I believe it's currently set at 7.5. And I've got a pretty good wager on the under. They open week 1 in Vegas against LSU. They've got road trips to Michigan, UCLA, Washington, Maryland, and Minnesota. Oh, and by the way, they still have to play Wisconsin, Penn State, Nebraska, and Notre Dame at home. So I think that for those reasons alone, Lincoln Riley said it last week during media days that USC is atop the Big Ten Conference and they're atop any conference that USC is a part of. Well, here's my hot take. USC goes 6-6 this year, and I think it's a pretty decent chance USC is not coaching, or Lincoln Riley is not coaching in LA next year.
They're going to be really interesting. Miller Moss was great in the bowl game. There was reports that he was a little underwhelming in the spring. They went out and they get Jaden Mayava, I believe is how you pronounce it, out of UNLV, who was a good player there. But you wonder, like, is he good enough to take USC, across the Big Ten and win games there? It's interesting. It's interesting for sure. I mean, I'll still take tons of pleasure in watching them lose.
Oh, absolutely. And again, it's a Lincoln Riley team. They're going to give up a lot of points, but they're going to score a ton of points as well. And I think that, the biggest indictment that I have on USC this year, it's not the fact that they're having to replace Caleb Williams, because I think in a Lincoln Riley offensive system, Miller Moss is going to be more than adequate, running that Trojan offense. But I mean, when you look at it, Adam, I think that there's a very realistic chance that USC, do they start 1-3 in the Big Ten conference play this year, and they still have matchups against Penn State, Washington, UCLA. I'll throw Nebraska in there as well. And then, oh, by the way, you've got to take on, Notre Dame in LA, but still it's the Fighting Irish, the type of football that they play. Even Caleb Williams couldn't overcome the Irish. So again, this schedule is absolutely brutal for replacing, 6 starters on offense, 2 or 3 on defense. I think that this is going to be an eye-opening experience for USC fans this year. 6-6.
Conference champion. You had Ohio State versus Oregon in the championship game. Did you give a prediction for who's winning that already?
No, I haven't yet. And, Adam, Ohio State by far and away the most talented team in the Big Ten. I think that an argument could be made that, they're neck and neck with Georgia as the most talented football team across the country in college football. But even with 16 returning starters, 9 of which are on defense, I still think that they're going to be tested this year. They've got to go on the road to Oregon. They've got to go to Penn State. They take on Iowa, Michigan, and Nebraska, all come into Columbus. And the one cause for concern, I think that you made a great point when you were talking about this a little bit earlier. I'm not sold on Howard being able to just come in and win Ohio State a Big Ten championship or even a national championship for that fact. Now, do I think he is an upgrade over Kyle McCord? Yes. But let's not forget, Will Howard got benched at Kansas State because Avery Johnson outplayed him once he got his opportunity. So even so, they still are the odds-on favorite to get to Indianapolis. And maybe it's a situation where the skill talent around Will Howard is just so good that, he just simply has to not screw it up. But this goes back to my Oregon take. This is my team in 2024. Dan Lanning, year 3, 12-2 a season ago. The only 2 losses being to a Michael Penix-led team in the Washington Huskies. They've got 17 starters returning. Offensively, they're poised to start 4 seniors and a junior on the offensive line. They've got arguably one of the top 3 wide receiver rooms in the country, highlighted by Tez Johnson, the speedster. And oh, by the way, they got Evan Stewart, the best wide receiver last year from Texas A&M. He's going to be joining the Ducks. And by the way, they add the current odds-on favorite to win the Heisman Trophy and quarterback Dylan Gabriel. DG with those skill guys in Eugene, look out Big Ten. I got the Ducks winning the Big Ten Conference this year.
So does that mean you have Ohio State going to Eugene and winning the regular season matchup with the Ducks? Or do you have them losing both? Okay. So Oregon gets revenge.
I do. I think I think that Ohio State goes on the road to Eugene. I think that Oregon's still going to be figuring a few things out early in the season. From everything that we've seen from Dylan Gabriel's career, he gets better as the season goes on, and I think that Ohio State will be able to catch Oregon just short of them being able to find themselves, get to that full gear. But I think that once you fast forward to the month of December, I think that they meet up again in Indianapolis. I think that Oregon knocks them off, and we'll see what I think about Oregon a little bit later.
My matchup is Ohio State versus Penn State. You talk about Will Howard, and is he a guy that's going to win you the game when he has to, because he's the quarterback, regardless of how good the team is around him? He's got to step up and just take over. I don't think Penn State's good enough to force Will Howard to do that, though. I think Ohio State is good enough to do that to Penn State. And Drew Aller, I like him. I'm not sold on him completely yet. So I'll take the team that has the better surrounding pieces across the board, the defense, the running backs, the wide receivers, proven to be good offenses, even with quarterbacks that maybe are lesser in some senses at Ohio State. So I'll take the Buckeyes not only to win the regular season matchup in Columbus versus Penn State, but in the championship game against the Nittany Lions there. So I'll take Ohio State. Spoiler, they are my number one overall seed when we get to talking national champions and playoffs. But let's move over to the Big 12. Tyler, what's your championship game matchup? I guess we'll be played in Dallas like usual.
Yeah, this one's going to be kind of a little bit of chalk for me as well. I've got Utah and Kyle Whittingham versus Kansas State. I think that obviously Utah making the transition, this being their first year in the Big 12 conference, they just play a brand of football that was pretty dominant in the Pac-12 conference over the last few years, especially with the quarterback that they've got out there, and we'll touch on him in a little bit. But I think that Utah, by far and away, is going to be the best team up there. I think that Kansas State is going to be second in the conference after the regular season. So I've got the Wildcats and the Utes meeting in Arlington for the Big 12 championship.
I also like Utah, Cam Rising coming back. You know the brand of football they're going to play. You know what kind of defense they're going to play under Morgan Scalley. So Kyle Whittingham, an experienced coach. I think you just love what the Utes are going to be able to bring to the table. So I've got them. For my other team, I'm going with someone that's got a lot of experience, bring a lot of returners back on both sides of the football, a really solid running back, a quarterback that takes care of the football, only 4 interceptions last year. I'm talking about the West Virginia Mountaineers. No, not Oklahoma State. I thought really hard about Oklahoma State. And I'm like, man, maybe I should have, because I like they have so much experience. They've got their quarterback back, Mike Gundy. I know that he's going to produce a good team of some sense, but it almost feels like when we don't expect them to do much, they do great. When we expect a lot out of them, they don't do well. So I don't know what to think about Oklahoma State. And this is me just taking a flyer on West Virginia, really, because you look at them last year, I think a lot of people will be really surprised to know that the Mountaineers won 9 games last year. 9 games. And really, they lost a game on the last play, like a Hail Mary type of fluke play against Houston. They would have been a 10-win team last year. So I like them. I like Garrett Green. He's a guy that put up over 3,000 total yards last year, 29 touchdowns, only 4 interceptions, takes care of the ball. They're going to play kind of a more of a ground and pound type of game with him. But I think it can be effective there. So they're going to get tested very early with Pitt, with Penn State on their schedule. But hey, they could lose both of those and build a lot of experience and character. And then everything else the rest of the way is going to be easier than that Penn State game in the Big 12. So I like the Mountaineers there to face off against Utah. We'll talk who's going to win that game in a second. But let's talk surprising team in the Big 12. Who do you got, Tyler?
Yeah, I'm going out on a limb here. And Adam, I think that the Big 12 is going to be a fascinating conference to watch this year. And I think that you could possibly make the argument that the Big 12 might be the most fun conference, the most wide open conference to possibly watch this year. But most surprising team this year, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I know that this team lost their head coach in Jed Fish to Washington. Here comes, stepping in from San Jose, head coach Brent Brandon. He takes over a Wildcat football team up there in Arizona that features one of the best quarterback wide receiver duos in college football with Fafita and McMillan. I like Arizona here. I think that they're going to surprise a lot of people in the Big 12 this year. The schedule is absolutely brutal. Make no mistake about it. They've got to go to Utah. They've got to go to K-State. They've got to go to Orlando. They've got to go to Fort Worth. But I think that their offensive firepower in this conference is good enough to keep them in any game that they play. I think that they're projected to finish towards the bottom of the pack, but I think that Arizona, led by the offense, led by the skill talent, especially at the quarterback position, he's kind of a dark horse to be a Heisman contender as well. I think that Arizona surprises a few people this year, and I think that they're a factor in the Big 12 this season.
I'm going to go to Orlando with Central Florida. No Kansas on the schedule.
That's a good one.
Kansas State. No Oklahoma State on the schedule. They return R.J. Harvey, who rushed for 1,400 yards and 16 touchdowns a year ago. At quarterback, that's kind of the talk of the offseason for them with KJ Jefferson and how much he looks like Cam Newton. I'm not buying that. I think he's just a slight upgrade over John Rice Plumlee. He's a guy with a lot of experience from his time at Arkansas, but Arkansas didn't do much while he was there. So I'm not buying the Cam Newton comparisons. I know people are just talking about him in terms of physical shape, size, weight, and things like that, and how Gus Malzahn knows how to use a player like that, but there's nothing about his game that says Cam Newton like that. You just can't do that. So I think he's a nice upgrade there, but I think UCF schedule wise comes out really well in the Big 12. I think they're year 2 of the Big 12. They're not going to be surprised by anything. They're going to know exactly what to expect, what kind of amount of physicality and grind they're going to have to go through in a power conference. So I like the Knights here to maybe surprise. Maybe they have a chance at making it to Dallas for the championship game, but I think they'll put together a really nice year. So that leads us to who's going to disappoint. Who you got?
Adam, I listed this team last year as my most disappointing team in the Pac-12, and I absolutely nailed it. Fast forward to 2024, I'm picking Colorado again this season. For all my listeners, all my friends and family out here in the Denver area, close your ears. I apologize, but we're going to lay this thing out here. 2024, another year of the Deion Sanders experiment where they neglect high school recruiting. They just overhauled their roster for the second consecutive year, processing well over 30 players. I know that Shedeur Sanders is back. Good player, not great. And the Buffaloes have, in my opinion, I'll give this guy credit, I think he's the most dynamic player in college football, and that's Travis Hunter. But this is going to be a tough schedule for Colorado this season. Road trips to Lincoln, Nebraska, Orlando for UCF. They got to go to Lubbock to take on Texas Tech. They've got to go to Lawrence to take on Lance Leipold and Jalen Daniels in Lawrence. And I haven't even mentioned the week 1 opener against North Dakota State. And you talk about some of the home games that they've got as well this year. Kansas State's coming to town. Utah's coming to town. Mike Gundy and the Pokes are coming to town. This is going to be another instance where the product on the field doesn't quite match the shine, the hype, the aura that's personified off the field. I think Colorado falls flat on their face for the second consecutive year.
Yeah, I kind of hope you're right. Like, I'm rooting against Colorado too.
Every single game. And again, that's hard. Like I said, I'm engaged. I'm about to marry a girl whose family is all CU fans. So that's going to be a little bit tough on Saturdays watching those types of football games. But it's just, I don't want to sit here and say that I don't respect what Deion's doing, because in one instance, I think that it's a show. It's a sideshow what he's doing. But at the same time, what he's done for Colorado, what he's done for Boulder, the local economy. I mean, Adam, call a spade a spade. Nobody gave a shit about Colorado football 18 months ago. But now, fast forward, you've got primetime in there, and you've got Shedeur, you've got Travis Hunter. There's a lot of limelight on this Buffaloes program, but I just think that this is an instance where, when you neglect high school recruiting and you bank on relying on bringing in kids from other programs, and not just 5 or 6 players to plug some holes on this on your starting 22. No, you're overhauling your entire roster, and I just don't think that that's a good formula to use here in 2024. Now we'll see what happens. Obviously, Shadeur's talented. He's not number 1 pick talented, but I think that they do have some good pieces that will allow them to be pretty competitive. But I think that Colorado fans are in for a rude awakening this year in the 12.
And he doesn't have the ingredients. We know this as Oklahoma fans. He doesn't recruit as well along the line of scrimmage. So yeah, he doesn't have the ingredients of being 8, 9 wins that I think a lot of people kind of think they could be.
And when you don't recruit, when you don't prioritize, and you don't develop the line of scrimmage, that's a bad recipe when you've got to take on Kansas State, Utah. I'll even throw North Dakota State in there as well with the type of football that they try to play. Don't be surprised if they knock Colorado off in week 1 on Thursday night up here in Boulder. But yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. I'm all in on it. Like I said, I'm not buying into the hype, but I'm going to be tuning in.
I might get burned by my pick here. The most disappointing team in the Big 12, it's going to be Kansas. And Jalen Daniels could ruin this prediction for me. If he's healthy the entire year, he probably ruins this prediction. But he hasn't been completely healthy. For 2 seasons, we've seen him with injuries. And no longer is Jason Bean going to be able to back him up and keep things steady for the Jayhawks. And also, too, they're not going to be playing games in Lawrence, Kansas this year. They're going to be playing their games at the Chiefs Stadium for a couple of the Big 12 games. They're going to be playing at the Sporting KC Stadium for a couple of their smaller opponent games as their field gets demolished and renovated and rebuilt from the ground up. So I wonder how much that affects them, how much home field advantage they truly have. Are their students and fans going to travel out to those games? I know they have a big presence in Kansas City, but are people from Lawrence going to go all the way to Arrowhead for something like that for a matchup versus, say, Houston, for example? Like, are they going to care enough for that? They won 9 games last year. A lot of people expect them to contend for the Big 12 title, but I don't know. I feel like it's so easy for them to fall short of that. Still have a good year, 7-8 wins, but be a little bit disappointing considering where they were a year ago. So it's going to be tough. they have a relatively winnable schedule, but I just don't know that they're going to be able to live up to competing for the Big 12 expectations, because there's like 5 or 6 teams that could win the Big 12. Someone's going to be disappointed. I'm just putting my money on the Jayhawks here. Yeah. So let's talk who's going to win the conference.
Do you know which opponents Kansas is playing at the Chiefs Stadium?
They got TCU, Houston, Iowa State, and Colorado.
Do they fill up the lower bowl?
I don't think that they're going to have the upper bowl even available.
Okay, makes sense. Makes sense. It's probably a good idea here.
Weird situation set up. So let's talk who's going to win that Big 12 championship game. You had Kansas State versus Utah in your matchup. Who takes the crown there?
Yeah, I've gone back and forth on this one a couple of times. I actually changed it halfway through my talk on both Utah and Kansas State here. So I think that these are going to be two football teams very similar in style. Both have two head coaches that like to play the same brand of football. Obviously, it's tough, gritty, hard-nosed, pound it down your throat, try to run the football, assert their dominance, impose their will. And I think that Chris Klein and Kansas State, obviously, coming off of a 9-4 season, they've got there's a lot of hype around, the quarterback Avery Johnson and with what he's going to be able to do in this offense for, taking over for Will Howard here. They do replace 7 starters on offense, which, does give them a little bit of time, obviously, because I do think that when you look at their schedule, as long as they can get things figured out by the month of October, I think that Kansas State is poised to have a pretty good season up there in Manhattan. But I've got 2024 in the Big 12 chalked up to the Cam Rising Revenge Tour. He got hurt a year ago, wasn't able to, help his team compete for a 3rd consecutive Pac-12 championship. He had to sit out on the sidelines for the most of the final part of the regular season. And I think that he's coming back for what feels like his 11th year of football at Utah. I think that with what Utah is going to be able to do, obviously having 15 starters back on for this football team in what was an 8-5 year, you look at the schedule for them, it's really not overly that difficult. They do have, I'd say that they're probably their most difficult game right now. They've got to go to Stillwater. They've got to go down to Orlando for the regular season finale. But I think that Utah is going to be able to do some really nice things on offense. And even though they are replacing a few guys on that side of the football, anytime that you've got a veteran quarterback that's seen everything that could possibly be thrown at them, I like Cam Rising, this Utah football team, and this is a good matchup. I think that, obviously we'll have to see how this thing plays out, but when you look at the way that these two teams approach the game, particularly on offense, this could be, 3-7, 10-point ball game. But after watching how Kyle Whittingham and this Utah coaching staff, how they matched up against the high-powered offenses of Washington and USC and Oregon over the last few seasons in the Pac-12, I think that Utah is going to be able to just push the right amount of buttons to get them over the hump here. I'm taking Utah to win the Big 12.
I'm going with Utah as well over West Virginia. Old man Rising can smell the playoffs. He's been to the Rose Bowl before, but has not had his opportunity to win a national championship. And so I think that propels Utah in Dallas there to take the Big 12 in year 1. So I'm going with them as well. Let's move on to.
Are we sleeping on Oklahoma State? Or is this just simply Mike Gundy? We know what he is. He usually does his best when the expectations aren't high. And I think that right now most people have them picked either 2nd or 3rd in the Big 12 conference right now behind Utah and, kind of flip-flopping with Kansas State. But are we shorting Mike Gundy and the Cowboys the respect they're due?
I have a lot of respect for them, and obviously they have a lot of talent returning. They're going to be one of the best teams in the Big 12. What I don't have confidence in is Alan Bowman. Like, we're lining up behind one of the most experienced and one of the most accomplished quarterbacks probably ever in Utah history, outside of Alex Smith, possibly. So I just don't see Alan Bowman carrying the Oklahoma State team. And if you're relying on Ollie Gordon, it's not going to be a surprise anymore. He definitely got slowed down as the year went on last season. And they brought in some key running backs in reserve to take some of that load off of his shoulders. So I just wonder if Oklahoma State will be dynamic enough to win the Big 12 title when you've got some really good quarterbacks like Avery Johnson, like Cam Rising, for example, that could be a lot better than what Oklahoma State's going to be able to put on the table. So that's my 2 cents. We'll talk. Let's talk SEC, though. The final conference, the one we've all been waiting for a little bit here. Tyler, lay it on us. Who's going to make the championship game in Atlanta?
Well, Georgia's going to be there. We can just go ahead and throw that out there. Most talented team, Carson Beck at quarterback, Kirby Smart, now the best coach in college football with Nick Saban retiring. I think that Georgia's going to be there. They do have a difficult schedule by comparison to previous seasons up there in Athens. They do have the trip out to Austin to take on Texas. They do have to go on the road to Ole Miss. And then when you kind of look at some of the other games that could be a trap, obviously they've got to go to Lexington to take on Mark Stoops in Kentucky. And, oh, by the way, week 5, they got to go on the road to Alabama and take on Jalen Milroe. So obviously the potholes are there for Georgia to kind of get tripped up. But I think that the SEC this year, and we're going to have a lot of fun talking about this, especially when we have our preview and prediction episode for OU, when trying to look at the overall layout of the SEC this year. I think that this has an opportunity to where you could see 4 to 5 SEC teams in the playoff this season. You're going to have one that's going to be a top 4 seed, but I think that the SEC this year, I think that Georgia is head and shoulders above everybody else. And then kind of in that next tier, you've got Texas, you've got Alabama, Ole Miss is a part of that as well. But then really, once you kind of get to that 5 through 10, 11, I think that you're going to have a situation where does the SEC kind of cannibalize each other here, where you've just got teams knocking off one another left and right. But yeah, I think that Georgia is going to be one of the representatives in Athens in Atlanta this year. Surprise, surprise. Call me crazy, Adam, but I'm riding the Lane Kiffin train. I'm taking Ole Miss to be the other member joining Kirby Smart in Atlanta this year. This on paper, and I've got a good buddy, Ole Miss alum, diehard Rebel fan. Cannot wait for this upcoming season. This on paper is the best, most talented team possibly in Ole Miss history. They've got Jackson Dart coming back. They've got a plethora of skill talent, especially out at the wide receiver position. Ole Miss might have the best wide receiver core in the country. And then you factor in what they've done in the transfer portal, bringing in a couple of tackles on the offensive side of the football to kind of plug some of those holes on the offensive line. They also, outside of Georgia, probably have the best defensive line in the SEC with Walter Nolan, with Jared Ivey, with Princely coming over from Florida. I think that the schedule is very favorable for Ole Miss this year. I'm not saying that they're going to run the table. I'm not saying that they're going to go 11-1, but I think that they are going to be able to do just enough to win the tiebreaker. I think it's Ole Miss and Georgia in Atlanta.
We have 2 different matchups in this game. I looked at Alabama and Georgia, 2 most talented teams in the conference, 2 best programs in the conference, but Georgia goes to Alabama, I think, in week 4 of the season. So I'm rolling with the Crimson Tide there as my first team in Atlanta. I think that, they may be looking a little bit different, but I think they have enough to get to the SEC title game. And then I'm going to go with Texas as my second team. I think they just, they're almost just guaranteed to be in at this point because of the schedule that they have. I mean, Vanderbilt's not going to upset them. Mississippi State's not going to upset them. I don't think Kentucky has what it takes. Florida, I know we're a little bit higher on than probably most people are, but they get to host Florida at home this season. They go to Arkansas.
They got 3 games.
Yeah, they're playing a 3-game schedule between Michigan, Georgia, and Oklahoma, and that's it. Maybe Kentucky. Or A&M.
I'm sorry, backtrack. A&M. 4 games. A&M.
Yeah, A&M. Yeah. Now, Arkansas and A&M are in a category where you look at it and go, by the end of the year, are those teams 4-7 and they don't have a whole lot to play for? And it's just, they're going to be nuts and crazy. They want to win and ruin Texas's season, but neither of those teams is very good. We'll find out. But for the most part, Texas will have a severe talent advantage over pretty much everybody they play. I definitely think Texas has a ton of holes. It would not surprise me if they lost 4 games this year, but they just have a cakewalk of a schedule, just like kind of a direct ticket to Atlanta. So I'm going with the Longhorns to face off against Alabama. But let's dive in. So most surprising team in the SEC, who you got?
Texas A&M. Mike Elko takes over for Jimbo Fisher in College Station and really inherits a very talented Texas A&M football team. Yes, they have some question marks, particularly with the health of quarterback Connor Wegman, how well he's able to bounce back from a season-ending injury a year ago. I thought that Connor Wegman was playing like one of the top 3 quarterbacks in the SEC before he got hurt. So if he's back to 100%, I think he's poised to have a big year down there in Aggie land. I think a huge factor to that prediction coming to fruition is A&M's offensive line, where much like Oklahoma, there's a lot of young, talented guys in that room, but how do the pieces fit together? How does A&M's offensive coaching staff get those guys over the course of the next 4 to 5 weeks of fall camp? How are they able to, get those guys to gel when these things kick off here in week 1 in about a month's time? The defense is going to be nasty. And you combine that with a schedule that includes a tough home opener against Notre Dame, home games against Texas, LSU, and Missouri. But, and this is why I'm so high on them, Adam, because I think that they're going to win a couple more games this year than they haven't in years past. A&M does not face an SEC team on the road this year that had a winning record last season. I think Mike Elko hits the ground running in Aggie land. I think he's a good fit for this program because he's not a prom queen. He's not a diva with an attitude. He's a tough-minded, no BS, good football coach, and that's what Texas A&M needs. I'm not saying A&M is going to be an SEC contender, but I believe that they will ruin a couple of team seasons, particularly the Clowns down in Austin.
So finally, we agree on something. I think for the first time since we said Clemson was going to win the ACC. So I've also got A&M as my most surprising team.
Look at us.
They open the year with Notre Dame. If they can win, I think it's a very winnable game in College Station for them. That can create a ton of forward momentum through a very winnable schedule that they have. There's almost no expectations on them this year. I think they were picked, 9th or 10th in the SEC. Mm-hmm. Connor Wegman. Mm-hmm. A lot of people haven't seen him because of the injuries. So if he's able to stay healthy, they can kind of have that hunter mentality throughout the season rather than the hunted, kind of other teams coming to College Station and beating the Aggies. The pressure is all on other teams at this point. It's not on the Aggies. Texas is the new kid in town. They're getting all the talk. So I like where A&M sits from a mentality standpoint. They still have a lot of talent. I think I agree with you on Mike Elko. He's kind of a no-nonsense type of coach, it seems. So we could see maybe the best version of the Aggies in several years, potentially. But as far as teams that aren't going to live up to the hype, the most disappointing team in the SEC, I'm curious to hear where you're going to go with this one.
Let's start with you. Let's kick it back over here because I think we might be in the same line of thinking on this one.
So, no, I'm going somewhere different that you're not expecting. I'm going to go with Georgia here. I didn't have them in my SEC title game, and I think that probably is a disappointment if they're not there. And I don't think that Georgia is necessarily going to have a bad year. I'm about this close to picking them to win the national championship game. I'm going to have someone else winning it all. But they are playing one of their toughest schedules that they've played really in years. They're at Bama. They're at Ole Miss. They played Tennessee. They're at Texas. They've got Clemson to open the year. So they've got a difficult schedule to navigate. They, I think, by far have the best talent across the board of any team, maybe not named Ohio State, in the country. So they're going to win a lot of games. They may win the national championship, but as far as the regular season goes, if they lose 2 games, which is very possible with that type of schedule, I think that's disappointing. So yes, they're at the top. I still think they're a great team. I still think they're probably have one of the best chances to win the national championship. But as far as the regular season goes, I think there might be some disappointment there. And maybe that's them just knowing that, hey, we don't have to go to the SEC title game. We can just be our best version of ourselves, work on ourselves in the regular season in anticipation of making the playoff, whether that's the 5 seed, 6 seed, 2 seed, 1 seed, doesn't matter. They like their chances once they get to the playoffs, and they can treat the SEC championship game week as a bye week potentially, rather than playing in that game and beating up against Texas or Alabama or whoever it is, Oklahoma, that might be there.
Yeah.
And so maybe they just view things differently than other teams like Ole Miss that are like, let's go win the SEC. This is our year.
Mm-hmm. And Adam, that's a really good example. And you can even look back to last season where, Georgia was left out of the playoff. They stubbed their toe in the SEC championship game, losing to Atlanta, ultimately got left out as the number 5 team in the college football playoff rankings. Now, I think a lot of people, after watching how the playoff, kind of played out, if Georgia would have had an opportunity to at least have a seat at the table and have an opportunity to compete for a national championship last year, I think that they probably would have won it, just because I think that they were the best team in college football last year. The matchup against Michigan would have been a lot of fun, but in that particular style of matchup, I think that Georgia probably would have held up much better against Michigan than they would have against Alabama. But you make a good point. They are going to face 3 teams on the road that are probably all going to be ranked in the top 10 by the time that game comes around. You talk about Alabama, you talk about Texas, you talk about Ole Miss. It's a tough schedule that Kirby Smart's going to have to navigate. So it's not the craziest prediction in the world. I think that there is some merit there to what you're saying, Adam. But most disappointing team for me, This might be low-hanging fruit. This might be a personal vendetta. It's Missouri. 11-2 last season. They had the Cotton Bowl win over Ohio State, a team, the Buckeyes, who were playing with what felt like half their roster. I know they've got a lot of momentum right now with Brady Cook coming back at the quarterback position. Luther Burden, the best wide receiver in college football. Alongside him, you've got Theo Weiss, you've got Mookie Cooper. Missouri's going to score some points, especially against what looks like the easiest schedule in the SEC outside of Texas. They kick things off in the non-con. They've got Murray State. They've got Buffalo. They've got Boston College. They take on Vanderbilt. There's 4-0. Then they've got a bye week before their season actually starts when they've got to go to College Station and take on Texas A&M. That's where it begins for the Tigers this year. At UMass, Auburn at home. They go to Alabama. Then they get a bye week before Oklahoma comes to Columbia. And then they close things out against what has an opportunity to be the easiest closing 3-game stretch in the SEC this year. At South Carolina, at Mississippi State, Arkansas. It's a 3-game schedule for Missouri this year. Texas A&M
is 9-3 disappointing, or do they have to go 8-4 then?
I think 9-3. I think 9-3 is disappointing. I think that the hype train has gotten a little bit out of control, and I agree. I don't see this as a 10 or 11 win football team like most people do. I mean, I know that a lot of people are riding high. They're talking about the 11-2 type season that they had a year ago. We talked about how they faced a depleted Ohio State team that was playing with their third, fourth scout team guys in the Cotton Bowl. They had to come back against a Kansas State team that blew a double-digit lead. They had to make a 60-yard field goal to win that game against the Wildcats. So, again, they've got road trips to College Station and Tuscaloosa. They've got to deal with Auburn and Oklahoma at home. And I think that's something that's not getting talked about enough. They lose running back Cody Schrader, who ran for over 2,000 yards a year ago. It's going to be difficult for the Tigers to replicate that type of production in the backfield. And while I think they are going to win some football games this year, I do not believe, like many out there, that they have a legitimate shot to make it to Atlanta and play for a conference championship. So I'm going Missouri, dude.
I don't disagree with you there. I would love to see them lose 4 games. I don't know where the 4th loss comes to. Maybe Auburn, maybe at South Carolina. But yeah, they've got one of the easiest schedules I maybe have ever seen.
Well, and something else to think about too. I mean, with there being so many good competitive teams in the SEC this year, if you go 9-3, chances are whoever's going to be that second representative in the SEC title game this year, there's going to be a tiebreaker factor that comes into this. So if you've got losses to Alabama, if you've got a loss to Oklahoma, then those are probably going to be 2 teams, knock on wood, that if all things play out like we expect them to, those are going to be 2 teams that the tiebreaker effect is going to be coming into play for you as a program. So we'll see. But yeah, I'm going to roll with Missouri here as being a team that, not saying that they're going to go 7-5, but the expectation up there in Columbia right now with what Drinkowitz is doing right now, Missouri fans think this is a team that's going to be 11-1, possibly 12-0. And I'm sorry, but that's just simply not going to happen.
They're drinking something, and it's not good for them. Speaking of the title game, I had Texas playing Alabama. I'm taking Alabama to win that in Atlanta. I think there's a lot of revenge factor there from a year ago from what the Longhorns did in Tuscaloosa, and they're going to see a very different Jalen Milroe if they're indeed the matchup that makes it to the SEC title game. So I've got Alabama. I think they'll probably I think they'll face off against a Texas team that wasn't as good as last year's team, if that is the case. So roll Tide.
Ole Miss is going to be the 1 seed in this game. Ole Miss is going to go 11-1 in the regular season. The 1 loss is going to be to Georgia when they face off on what is going to be November 9th in Oxford. And I think that Georgia, they're going to lose a couple of football games this year, but they're going to do just enough. A couple of things are going to fall their way to where they're going to figure out a way to make it back to Atlanta. And what I think is going to be a rematch with Ole Miss. And I think that Georgia, I trust Kirby Smart more than Lane Kiffin in big-time games. So I think that Georgia is going to knock off Ole Miss for the 2nd time this year, and I think that Georgia is going to be the SEC champion.
I like it. Let's talk real quick before we end the pod, Heisman winners and our national champion winner. For Heisman, I'll kick us off here. Typically it's been who's going to be the best player on one of those 4 teams that makes the playoff. We now have a 12-team playoff. So my thinking here is that, okay, there's going to be an expansion of potential candidates here. And who's going to have one of the best storylines this year? I think it's going to be Riley Leonard at Notre Dame, because he's going to have the opportunity to go there and be what Sam Hartman, what they thought he was going to be a year ago. Now, he's got to stay healthy, but he's got marquee games and opportunities to stay in the spotlight from game one at Texas A&M. In the middle of the year, they play Florida State. They round out the year playing USC. So he's got big opportunity spotlight games to really show off and carry Notre Dame, I think, relatively easily to the playoffs. And that will be a great storyline to say, hey, here's what the missing piece, the dynamic quarterback. And we saw that at Duke. If he's able to stay healthy, he could have maybe not the most mind-blowing stats, but probably one of the best stories, which is what the Heisman voters really love. So I'll take Riley Leonard from Notre Dame.
Dylan Gabriel is going to win the Heisman Trophy this year.
I would love to see it. I would root for him.
I would love to see it. We know what a Heisman Trophy winner looks like. Obviously, here at the University of Oklahoma, got quite a few of them, especially in years past. To be a Heisman Trophy winner, not only do you have to be one of the best players on the best teams in college football at the end of the year, which I think Oregon is going to be one of those, because like I said, I think that they're going to win the Big Ten championship, but you also, as a Heisman Trophy winner, you have to play your best brand of football in the biggest stages when the lights are the brightest and the national TV is the spotlight is on you. And Dylan Gabriel is going to have an opportunity to do so. Ohio State's coming to Eugene. He's got to go on the road to Ann Arbor. He's got a couple of other big-time matchups where he's got to go to Camp Randall to take on Wisconsin. Washington's going to be coming to Eugene to close out the regular season. And then, oh, by the way, I think it's going to be a rematch against Ohio State in Indianapolis. I think that Dylan Gabriel, when you look at the supporting cast that he has, and I'm not taking anything away from what Oklahoma has had at the skill position over the last couple of seasons, but I think that with what the tools and weapons that Dylan Gabriel is going to have to play with out at Eugene this year, I talked about Evan Stewart. We talked about Tez Washington. The tight end that they've got is phenomenal. I think that Dylan Gabriel is going to light it up this year. No shade. Obviously, he's a legend at Oklahoma. What he did that OU Texas final drive, that's something that'll be talked about for hundreds of years here in Norman, Oklahoma. But I think at the end of the day, Dylan Gabriel, I think that this, it's a movie. And the story kind of writes itself. And I think that Dylan Gabriel going out to Eugene with Dan Lanning, with that skill talent, Dylan Gabriel is going to win the Heisman Trophy this year.
We're not going to unveil our full 12-team playoff bracket. We're just going to pick a national championship winner. If you want to know what we think of Oklahoma's chances to make the playoffs, we're going to have a team prediction specific to OU in the coming weeks. So make sure you're subscribed on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts so you make sure you don't miss that. But let's just give our national champion winner. Tyler, I'll get us kicked off here and you can round us out. For me, my Big Ten winner was Ohio State. My SEC winner was Alabama. I also have Georgia very closely in that mix as well. But I'm going to go with the Buckeyes. The national championship game is in Atlanta, so I don't feel great about that if the Buckeyes have to play Georgia or even Alabama in Atlanta. But the Buckeyes have so much talent. And we talk about Will Howard and how oftentimes in college football, it comes down to that quarterback and who has the best one. And that's the team that's going to win the game. But I just think Ohio State has so much talent that it almost doesn't matter at that point. And I've got the Buckeyes winning it all.
I'm in agreement with you that I think that two of the best three teams in the country are in the Big Ten, in Oregon and Ohio State. And I think that that's why there's such a huge emphasis. That's why it's so important for Oregon and Ohio State for what's going to be, I think, two matchups this season. You obviously think that Penn State's going to be, part of that equation in Indianapolis. But I think that the winner of the national championship this year is going to be from the Big Ten, but I think that it's going to be the Oregon Ducks. I think that Oregon, I don't necessarily think that they're going to run the table, but I think that they're going to do enough this year to where they're going to cap the regular season off with a pretty impressive win over Ohio State, and I think that they're going to lock up the 1 seed. They're going to get the bye week. They're going to get, possibly the Big 12 champion. In the semifinal game. And I think that Oregon, I know that Dan Lanning hasn't always, lived up to the big stage when Oregon gets to some of these big time games, obviously 0-2 in the last couple Pac-12 championships. But I think that this is finally the year 3 of the Lanning era. He's got his guys. He's got a dominant elite defense. He's got, elusive, elite skill talent on offense. He's got one of the best quarterbacks in the country in Eugene right now, replacing another Heisman finalist as well. But I think that this is, call me crazy, it's a storybook ending. Dylan Gabriel, going from UCF to Oklahoma, having to transfer to Oregon for his final season of college football. I think that DG wins the Heisman and Oregon wins the national championship.
Thanks everyone for tuning into the Main Line this week. Next week starts season 5 of the Main Line, and we'll be digging into a couple different things over the coming weeks, including a specific show just around the biggest questions around offense for Oklahoma, another show around the biggest questions for defense, and then talking about team preview as well. And then before you know it, will be a game week. So we appreciate everyone being a part of the Main Line this week, and we will see everyone next week for the next episode.